Now, my talk today takes the basic assumption that literacy is an individual and socially transformative technology. And I think that's something that we would all share. I'm going to be talking about a broad sweep of literacy development, so I'll include the early years, but I'm also going to look at some work that takes us up into the primary and secondary schools. I'll be talking about two projects in particular that I'm associated with and that are part of what we call the Early Start Initiative at the University of Wollongong. And the Early Start Initiative is a multi-million-dollar facility for teaching and research, and its goals are to enhance the life outcomes of children and their families from disadvantaged backgrounds, children being a 0 to 12 age group. So it's a new initiative and it's interdisciplinary. But I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves that literacy is the ultimate transformative technology. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is talk a little bit about the curriculum and research context in Australia and for these two projects, and I'll be interweaving the three as I go. And then it's also pointed out to me that I do have a lot of slides, so I'll move us through fairly quickly. So one of the important things in our context is that Australia likes to imagine itself to be an egalitarian society, yet there are some fairly concerning statistics floating around at the moment. One of which is we've got a lot of our young people completing Year 12 now because of changes in legislation. However, many of those students are not finding full-time work, nor are they in study. So more than 40% of those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are disengaged from work or study. And the gap between this group and the group that's best served by education, it seems to be widening. With respect to international tests, such as the PIRLS, Australia ranks 27th out of 48 countries. With respect to PIAC, the Program of International Assessment of Adult Competencies, it suggests as many as 1 in 8 Australians, adults, as functionally illiterate. So in a recent government report, it concluded there's an unacceptable link between low levels of achievement and educational disadvantage, particularly among students from low socioeconomic and Indigenous backgrounds. At the same time, we have a new Australian curriculum, and that's aspirational. And the kinds of aspirations it has for students' literacy refers to multiple capabilities. The capability to engage in educational activity, out of school, civic participation, so literacy for all kinds of activities. It expects that students be able to manage multimodal platforms fluently. It expects that students' capacities are able to respond to different contexts of use, particularly the specialised discipline areas of secondary schooling and beyond, and the need for these capabilities, these literate capabilities, to be systematically maintained over time. And that's the issue that I'm going to I'll fly some kites about today, because we don't have the research base to see what it looks like to be literate over time, and particularly what the journey of being moving through our educational system looks like for individual groups of students. Our new Australian curriculum that I've just mentioned covers those compulsory years of school to Year 10. It also, in English, looks at 3 strands: language, literature and literacy. So here we have literacy interwoven with language and literature. There's an expectation that all teachers in schools will be teachers of literacy. So with respect to the subject specialist teachers in secondary school, so from Year 7 to Year 12, there's an expectation that those teachers will teach literacy as well. And that's captured in the document that's called the General Capabilities Literacy. Here's a little snippet of what it looks like. So for the first time, those teachers are needing to have a good understanding of texts, of grammar, etc. Some states, such as South Australia, have developed materials that support the national curriculum. And for example, South Australia's produced genre maps for for most of the major discipline areas that are quite interesting. So that's what we've got in terms of our curriculum. That's a challenge at the moment. We've also got some very good research, and I'm going to talk about this research from Frances Christie and Beverly Derivienka. 2008, they published a book called School Discourse as a result of a large ARC grant that they'd completed, where they looked at over 2,000 texts written by students in the compulsory years of schooling. And they concluded, as a result of this study, that there was a significant change in literacy demands over time in the text students were expected to manage, use and produce. And their work, because they're linguists, their work is very detailed about these kinds of changes. The text reflected the increasing distinctiveness of each of the disciplines of school knowledge, and they identified 4 very broad stages at which students were expected to manage and produce literate language. Now, their study was focused on writing, so they had more to say about what the students were expected to produce. The first stage they talk about is the early childhood stage. Now, they didn't look at preschool writing, they were looking at the first year of school on. And in this stage, where they talk about from years 6 to 8, they found that the kinds of texts the students were producing represented very simple kinds of common sense knowledge in what's called a congruent form. So the language in which the forms of the words reflect the simple structure of the actual activities. For example, the doer of an activity is in the subject position of the clause, and the verb is the doing, with very simple expressions of attitudes and or evaluations. And there's an example of a recount of the 3 Little Pigs that is the typical text produced in early childhood, in this early childhood phase. Time sequenced, about events and happenings. Again, talking about attitude, very early personal response. I'm sure lots of you know this book, Who Sank the Boat? And this is a nice little response from a child. My favourite character was the donkey and the cow because they were both big. Very straightforward expressions of attitude. So there we've got our early childhood. This, again, simple common sense knowledge that represents events and happenings in the real world. Then their second identified phase is what they call the late childhood, early adolescence, 9 to 12 years. And here the everyday knowledge is beginning to be elaborated as they're moving into written language, and the texts reflect that grammar of written language. Their attitudinal resources are enhanced. So here's a book review of a book called, I'm not expecting you to be able to read that terribly well, but of a book written by Morris Gleitzman about refugees and asylum seekers. And you'll notice that the kinds of expressions of attitude there are moving away from the I loved it or I didn't like it and into more distant, objective sounding attitudes using different resources from the appraisal system. So this book has believable characters, it's a well-paced story, so they're able to comment about compositional issues, a moving fictional novel, and that affect is being pushed into appreciation as a reaction. So that's the kind of development they noticed in this stage. Common sense knowledge becomes elaborated as students' language resources expand. And in our other projects where we've looked at how teachers teaching grammar in the primary school, we note about this middle stage of primary up, there's a shift from action processes, action verbs, and into the more relational kinds of processes that represent the kinds of identifying, classifying or taxonomizing that's going on. And the beginning of abstract kinds of participants too. So in this particular class, the students were looking at changes of states of matter in Year 3. So, one of the first projects I'm going to introduce is one that comes from a small town in northwestern Victoria, about 400 kilometres northwest of Melbourne. And it's one of 8 projects around the state of Victoria funded by the Victorian government to enhance literacy outcomes in particular communities. The projects are all collaborative projects developed between schools, private and public schools, or independent and public schools, the local shire or local government authority, and preschools. So they're community-based, and Warracknabeal is one of those 8. And if you wanted to have a look at what they, a little bit more closely at the project, that they're on YouTube, so there's a linking learning video on YouTube. Now, this is the river at Warracknabeal. It's a very typical Australian rural setting. Wheat country. Continued drought, though, has meant that, and changes in agricultural processes have meant that a lot of traditional farming families have moved away from the area. And as city accommodation costs have risen, more families have moved out into the countryside and settled where housing is much more affordable. So there's been a changing demographic in this particular community. The town itself has 3,500 people in it. There's a secondary school, there's a public primary school and a Catholic primary school, there's a kindergarten, the preschool, year before school, a long day care, and a very strong maternal health and welfare and wellbeing unit. And that particular community developed a project and invited Professor Iram Siraj and I to be involved with it, and it's very interesting. So what their aspirations are, just trying to go backwards there. Oops. Okay, so it's funded to the tune of $240,000 over 3 years, and I should also say that what the community, the school principals had identified was a drop in student achievement as measured via our national assessment program, NAPLAN, particularly in writing. So writing in the upper primary and lower secondary results were declined over a period of time. So the project aims to address that declining achievement levels by enhancing the language and literacy outcomes for children from birth to 12. So what they've done is they've aimed at harnessing local community, working closely with families, particularly the most vulnerable. Their project has a very strong oral language focus, and there's a focus on continuity in learning from prior to school to secondary school. And as I've said, there's strong cross-sectoral involvement, and all of the stakeholders are engaged in the evaluation of the program alongside the state government. And I'm involved with Iram in what's called the research project part of it, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, this is an overview of the project. So, there are educators involved and the community, and I'll read across from left to right and tell you what each of the projects involves. The reading leaders involves training secondary students in year 9 and 10 to read with younger children in the preschool and the primary school. So the kinds of training that they've had has been led by this local speech pathologist, and they've learned how to read with young people. And on that video, if you look at YouTube, you can see these young students doing that, and they've been very well trained on how to talk about a text with the younger children. There's our research project. Our research project is about delivering professional learning to the teachers, in educators across the context as they have identified it. It's slightly different in the prior to school setting to what it is in the primary setting. Iram has focused quite heavily in the prior to school setting, looking at measures of the learning environment there based on her work with Ted Malouche in that large EPSI project. I've focused more on the primary, looking at how we can support students there with their writing. We're also supporting them with evaluation, how to engage in undertake their evaluation. Now, the community aspects are quite interesting. One of the project ideas that the management team, steering committee, came up with was the idea of the Hope Cafe. A cafe in town, because there are so many empty shops, there's a lot of space. So the Hope Cafe was to be a place where parents could come with their children, they would have free Wi-Fi, have coffee, their children would be read to, there'd be books there, they could borrow books, etc. That's morphed a little bit into something else, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But there's some wonderful ideas that have come out of this project. The reading volunteers come from all over the community, and they're people who are prepared and read anywhere. They've got this notion that reading should happen anywhere, in playgrounds, in playgroups. And so the reading anywhere includes things like putting in comfortable reading spaces into the local Lions Park. Now, what's happened with the Hope Cafe is that the steering committee were concerned that that was an area that was waiting for people to come to it. They'd much rather go to people. So it's become a little bit like a pop-up reading cart with coffee, etc. now. So the reading group goes and pops up somewhere on vaccination day, or pops up in the library, anywhere where there are groups of parents and young people. And the idea being that parents who are a little reluctant to read or a little nervous reading are exposed to models of reading with their children. The Let's Read project happens to run from the maternal child welfare group. So every child, when they're born in the community, is given, the parents are given a bag of books with some pamphlets, etc., talking about how to read, and then on their birthdays, on each birthday up until they're 5, they receive another set of books with activities. So it's a very strong multi-pronged approach that this group's undertaking. So we can talk about it in terms of, in the early years, laying the foundations, and then in the upper primary to lower secondary, building breadth and depth. Now, our research project in the first year, what we've participated in is an educators forum, a whole day where every educator in the schools were closed, preschools were closed, parents were on side, they kept their children home. We had everybody together for a whole day talking about the project and looking at data, looking at research. We also then had a parent community workshop and barbecue. We've been looking at evaluating sites using instruments such as the Sustained Shared Thinking and Emotional Wellbeing tool that Iram has developed. We surveyed the teachers, and it's interesting, the teachers had a whole range of experience, some very experienced people, some new teachers, and identified literacy leaders in each of the kinds of areas, stages. Started to set up some action research projects and to establish and monitor case studies. So in the next year then we'll be looking at what's going on, looking at some more specific measures and tools to support the development of pedagogy. We'll be continuing our professional learning program, continuing to support the action research projects. The action research projects are, I guess, adding the complexity and richness to the kinds of system level data that the government's monitoring the projects with. And then in year 3 we'll be looking at differentiation and evaluation. So that's that project. Throughout, though, our emphasis on trying to ensure that there's a continuity of experience from the very early years and onwards. Now, the third stage that Derivienka and Christie identified was mid-adolescence, 13 to 15 years, where we've got the language of abstraction, technicality and nominalisation emerging. This is this uncommon sense knowledge as it becomes increasingly salient when students engage with the subject matters of the secondary curriculum. So an attitude and opinion are extended. So these are the kinds of trends that Derevyanka and Christie observed. So what do we mean by abstraction, technicality and nominalisation? Technicality is simply the jargon used in a field of discourse. And it might be specialist terms, or it could be everyday words that get repurposed. Students find these very challenging. Abstraction includes summarising language like factors, issue, process. And then nominalisation, or what's often referred to as grammatical metaphor. So it turns language items into things that are not usually nouns. So verbs and adjectives become nouns. And I'll just elaborate that a little bit in a minute. But nominalisation is a key resource or a key tool for creating abstraction and technicality, which is why it's important that students learn to grasp it early. So, in a process of nominalisation, what were once activities or qualities become things. So then we can point to them, we can describe them, we can build information around them. In English, it's possible because in English, the noun group can be expanded exponentially. It's also called a process for thingizing. Nouns from verbs or adjectives, for example, reaction from react. Forming noun phrases from clauses, etc. So what we've got, here's a little example. Text 1, the debaters argued convincingly, so the audience applauded appreciatively. The debaters' convincing arguments drew appreciative applause from the audience. What's happened in the second text? We've moved from 2 clauses. We know it's 2 clauses in the first text because we've got 2 verbal groups into 1. What also has happened, so we've got argued, which is a process, a thing you do, say, in the first text, first sentence, into a thing, applause. Our argued has become arguments. And we've got the audience becoming tucked away at the end of a prepositional phrase there. And a new causative verb comes in. So we're able to manipulate our information like that. Also what's happened is the debaters, that was the subject of that sentence, the first one, has become a describer as part of that long noun group, the debaters' convincing arguments. And convincingly, which was an adverb, circumstance of manner, has become a describer as well. So nominalisation, grammatical metaphor, the process by which information gets packed up into nominal groups like that. So other examples, in maths, we'll have processes or verbs such as to change, become the change, and then get added to the rate of change, decreasing rate of change, 65% change in income. In science and geography, things like terrain become precipitation, which stands for a whole process. So you can see why technicality and abstraction are such challenges. And in this way, a text becomes more written-like. We can pack more meanings. Oh, goodness me, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened to my numbers there. Nominalisation help make a text more compact, but importantly it allows us to background and foreground particular information, and they're an important tool for building taxonomies of technical terms. So according to J. Lemke, the developmental transition from spoken to written registers is quite important for education, and the main point is that somewhere around the 7th year of schooling, students need to make this transition but are poorly prepared to do so. And poorly supported by schools and teachers because the nature of the transition is still largely invisible to the educational world. In simple terms, it's the acquisition of competence in academic registers through processes like nominalisations and other sorts of non-colloquial constructions, like our abstraction and technicality and their special semantic uses. So this idea of nominalisation or grammatical metaphor was key to these moves into up the literacy of mid-adolescence to late adolescence. Now, late adolescence is their last and fourth stage, 16 to 18 years. And it's only just in the last few months occurred to me that my first years at my university are actually in this group, late adolescents. The majority are 17, 18 years old. So the kinds of literate competencies they're coming to me, in their first, second, third weeks of university are these, or should be these. Because what happens at late adolescent is discipline knowledge is foregrounded. So whether that be the disciplines of late secondary or of the university. And the grammar of abstraction, consolidated judgment, opinion, attitudes, values expressed, and managing multiple voices. And they do, and my students do struggle with that. I teach language, so the kind of discipline knowledge that I'm working with them on is educational linguistics. And here's an example of a literacy task that my students do in about week 4 of their university course. They're given 2 texts, a biographical account of someone learning literacy, what they remember about learning language, and they're given a model academic essay. And their task is to compare these 2 texts. And they're given this as their prompt. As you read each text, think about how they're different. You might consider the following: the purpose of each text, the field or topic of each text, the tenor or the writer-reader relationships. You can see the sorts of abstraction and technicality we're into here, can't you? They've learnt about them, but they are new terms. The mode or the role of language that is playing in each text. And they have to write a brief description. There's the first text, the early literacy account, straightforward recount, and then here's the second one, an academic essay on scaffolding, the theory of scaffolding. So they have a look at these, and this is the kind of response that we get from our 17 and 18-year-old students who are wanting to be primary school teachers. The early literacy account, so the first text, is a piece of writing that can easily be identified as a recount and may be purposeful for a narrative or recollection of memories. This becomes evident through the use of storytelling conventions such as speaking in first person and retelling of past experiences. So I'm not going to read it all, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the kind of writing that they're expected to produce. The field of the piece is abstract, and the world being presented before the reader is human. And it goes on. There's very little grammatical metaphor in there yet, although it might be argued that the use of storytelling conventions such as speaking in the first person is on the way, because we've got a process packed up there. So what we tend to find in our students' writing at this level is that the processes or the verbs are nearly all relational. Okay, so we're out of the world of material events and happenings as the writer describes the register values of the text. So things like is, becomes, means, relatable are. Mental, we have some mental processes as evidence is introduced to support these claims, can be seen, are perceived to have. And abstract material, portrays, engages, demonstrates. So we're on the route to abstraction and technicality. The participant entities, what's engaged in our verb groups, are often semiotic entities in this subject, which is about language, as you might expect. And they become increasingly complex, because here's one particular noun group, a piece of writing that can be easily identified as a recount and may be purposeful for a narrative or recollection of memories. So we've got huge noun groups. A sense of powered reading-writing relationships, an ability to engage the reader, the writer's use of first-person concepts such as I and my. And we also have those technical participants that I mentioned before, the field of the text, the tenor of the text. We have some abstract attributes. Our circumstances also about semiotic place, so we're out of the real world. We don't find physical location anymore. We're finding semiotic location. And there's evidence of dialogic engagement, so the tenor values are developing here. To some, the reader, the writer, and some attitudinal resources. Whilst the writer does not know the reader well, the individual demonstrates an ability to engage their audience, etc. So there's development. But what we've got there in those few texts that we've seen is quite a journey. The nature of the journey is very complex, from early childhood to late adolescent. From who sank the boat to the description of the two texts is an enormous distance for someone to traverse in the space of really not too many years. And we don't know what it means for individual students. So the key findings from Christie and Derivienko is development in writing took different forms in different curriculum areas. For example, writing in history developed distinct patterns of meaning that differed from those evidenced in writing in English and science. In students' writing, it seemed clear that many students failed to make progress across stages 2 to 3. So that's about the middle years of primary to upper year to lower secondary. That sort of span from perhaps year 4 to about year 10 is where so many of them failed to make it into uncommon sense and grammatical complexity. In other words, middle primary years, 9 to 12 years, to early to middle adolescent are critical times for academic literacy development. So that kind of work has informed the second project I'm going to talk about, which is our Transforming Literacy Outcomes. We call it TransLit. It's a 3-year project, and even though $350,000 isn't a lot, it's a significant amount in Australian terms, because educational research isn't well funded generally. If we look at our national grants, educational research gets just a tiny portion of it. So this project evolved because we actually made the money ourselves doing some entrepreneurial work, and we're using it as a seed project for our external competitive grants. And it came at a time when we had a number of key senior people in the literacy field retire. Professor Beverly Derivienko retired from Wollongong, Professor Peter Freebody retired from Sydney, and we were able to draw them into the project team. So we've spent 12 months or so developing this research proposal and getting approval for it. Our research questions are: what is the nature of students' literacy experience at critical transition points in schooling? What is the nature of literacy demands at critical points? How do students experience those literacy demands at those points? And what kind of contextual factors are involved in teachers' and students' responses to these demands? Now, the first sub-question, what's the nature of literacy demands at critical transition points? We're doing classroom observations, video observations of literacy lessons. How do students experience the literacy demands at critical transition points? We're doing case studies. And then the contextual factors are drawn out of document analysis and interviews with the teachers and students. So they're our project participants, our project team. We have an international advisory panel that includes Deborah Myhill, Iram Siraj, Scott Paris, Barbara Coomer, Susan Hill and Christine Edwards-Groves. And we also have a local consultative group. The Big Fat Smile is a large provider of early years services, preschool services in our area. And we have representation from the New South Wales Department of Education and Training, and also a community consultant. So the project, we've identified what we think are key transition points. Now, one of the first things we did was commission a review of the research from the Australian Council of Education Research, which is still underway. But the preliminary findings is there's a lot about transition from prior to school settings. There's very little about other kinds of transition. There's some about the transition from primary school to high school, but a lot of both of those groups of research is about social emotional transition. It's not about the literacy demands. So we think that there's a real need to investigate those transition points more thoroughly. It's ongoing. We suspect a lot of the research will also be in the research into disciplinarity that's taken place in the last 5 to 10 years things such as Jim Martin and Carl Maton's work on the DISC project that we'll need to go to. But our transition points are, we know that there's the preschool to school transition. We, as educators, believe strongly there's probably one about year 2 to 3. And I think it was Meta, looking at the fourth grade slump. But we also talk about the year 3 slump in Australia too. And we also think that there's a year 6 to 7 as students transit from primary school to lower secondary, and then there's a junior secondary to senior secondary, year 10 to 11. So they're the 4 transition points that we've begun with. Of course, now we might be wrong. And we're also mindful, whenever we think of transition, we're also telling ourselves we should also think about disjunction. Transition seems to assume that there's a smooth pathway, but we suspect that for many students it's not so smooth. It's actually a very spiky moment when they move through. The other thing that we've got 3 years, so what we've done is our case studies cross-cohort. So in the first year we're looking at the cohort of students as they go from preschool, then in the next year we'll follow them to the first year of school, second year of school. At the same time this year we're starting year 2, and then we follow on to year 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. Now, we didn't start with year 10, we started with year 9 because we didn't want to miss year 9. We think a lot of things happen in our year 9 where students start to select their subjects for their senior. So it means that we've left out year 5 and year 12, and we're hoping to get some funding at the end of the 3 years to be able to pick up those. So that's our project. I mean, we've just begun our data collection. Let me tell you, our focus is on continuity and change. So to try and develop research tools that will allow us to ask similar questions that get at continuity and change across that span from preschool to senior secondary is really tricky. So for example, the observation schedules that we're using in the prior to school setting, in the preschool setting at the moment, have to be robust enough to collect data there, but also have to talk to the ones that are being used in the middle primary, the upper primary and secondary. And when the secondary, we're actually looking at English, history and science. So the secondary ones fan out. So we've spent months developing those. Similarly, the sorts of questions we ask our students, the participant students, the children and young people, have to be able to get data about how the students are experiencing changes. So the ones that what we ask of the preschool has to be different of what we ask for older students, yet the data has to be able to talk to each other. So again, it's taken quite a while, but we're trialling them in the first, what we call cluster. So who are our participants and where have we drawn them from? Because of our funding being relatively restricted, we've kept to our local area around Wollongong, and we've selected 3 school communities that we think are broadly representative of a range of demographics. So our first cluster is close to us. We're looking at our local primary school and its feeder preschool, and the high school, which happens to be a selective high school. Okay, so we're going in this, looking at preschool literacy activity at the end, at the moment, and then and year 2, and year 6, and year 9. Next year, we'll go into look at the first year of school, year 3, year 7, year 10, and so on like that. So that's the observation. And the students, we're selecting the students from the first year, from the preschool to follow through for 3 years. Then we've also got a cluster of considerably diverse linguistic population, and also low SES. And then we've got a fairly, we think, middle class, represent a middle class cluster in the rural school. So 9 sites. Their anticipated outcomes are case studies of the language and literacy students who up to experiences of up to 54 students from age 5 to 18. Detailed descriptions of the language and literacy pedagogy at key transition points in those 3 diverse educational communities and across school curriculum areas. So the kinds of things we're looking at is what kinds of reading and writing activities or composing and interpreting activities are going on in these classrooms, and we'll sample them early in the year. And we're just going to ask the educators or teachers to identify 2 or 3 connected series where they're addressing literacy, connected lessons. So we've first term and 4th term. We're interested in, yes, okay, so what roughly counts as reading and writing. We're also looking at oral language, how oral language is used in those sites, in those lessons. And because many of us, not all of us, but many of us on the project team are educational linguistics, we're very interested in the kind of meta-linguistic awareness that's going on, or metasemiotic awareness. So that's the sorts of things we're looking at in the pedagogy. Our review of the research, and we're hoping to identify some areas for future research, scaling up the project to some teachers across the country. And we want better partnerships between the university, the schools and early years settings. We want some evidence-based professional learning programs for educators, and importantly, we want to enhance our own curriculum in our teacher education programs. So we're thinking about advanced literacy studies at the postgraduate level. So that's our outcomes. Of course, you know, what kind of literacy position do we have as the team? And talking about the kinds of aspirations the curriculum has, and I guess we like the notion of repertoires, and we think that notion of expanding and consolidating students' repertoires is important. And we would expect to see that across those years we have evidence of that expansion. So perhaps moving from the informal oral sorts of activities in the preschool, prior to school setting, into more crafted oral, written and multimodal uses. We'd expect that the language of the everyday would be developed into abstract, specialised and technical language. And we'd expect that students' repertoires would be developed from informal, known kinds of interactants or interactions to a wider range of audiences. And we would expect to see something of breadth in the repertoire and depth of mastery from picture books and multimodal texts up to exploring and producing them across schooling. But Peter Freebody, who's on our team, cautions us. He says there's 2 dangerous myths about literacy. The first one is if it is done properly, then it's pretty well much over by year 3 or 4 for most students. If it's not done properly or some topping up is needed, then it's the job of the English department in high schools, or maybe the study skills, or the special education, or the support unit people. These myths represent a narrow view of literacy, a misunderstanding of the pervasiveness of literacy across the school experiences, and particularly of the importance of the need for literacy to grow rapidly through the middle years of school as the materials of the curriculum become more distinct and specialised. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about what James Heckman says, is that investment in early education for disadvantaged children from birth to age 5 helps reduce the achievement gap, reduce the need for special education, increase the likelihood of healthier lifestyles, lower the crime rate and reduce overall social costs, and Susan talked about those this morning. But he also goes on to say we should build on that foundation with high quality elementary and secondary education to sustain the development of successful lives. And one of the things that I did note from the review of the research that's done so far is somebody and I just can't remember who it is, someone writes about the early bloomer who looks like they're going to do well early, but then peters out by middle to upper primary. So we've got those kinds of stories. But Barbara Coomer, who's also one of our advisory panel, reminded us in a meeting recently, sure, the early years are important, but it's not over then. I think on that note I'll finish. Thank you.